Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight we step into a chapter rarely spoken aloud. What happened to Italian nuns under Ottoman soldiers became something many witnesses believed was worse than death itself. There are records of women who begged not to be killed, not because they feared dying, but because they feared what would come after. You open a heavy wooden door. It groans softly on iron hinges. The air smells of damp stone, melted candle wax, and old linen. Before we continue, take a deep breath. If you find this journey meaningful, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to Grimverse History, and turn on notifications, so you can return whenever the world feels too loud. It is the late medieval period. Southern Italy trembles at rumors carried by sailors and refugees. Ottoman banners have been seen across the sea, and behind convent walls, women are being taught something chilling, that death may not be the worst fate awaiting them. The incense still clings to her habit. Sister Lucia is 26 years old, and she can still smell the myrrh and frankincense from the morning prayers, mixing now with something else. Lobo, smoke, and beneath the smoke, the copper salt tang of blood seeping through the cathedral stones. She was, until 3 hours ago, a bride of Christ at the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine. You are standing where she stands. The stone beneath your feet is cold. The air is thick enough to taste. A woman who had taken vows at 16 and spent 10 years in contemplation, prayer, and the quiet work of illuminating manuscripts that the monastery sold to churches throughout the Italian peninsula. Now she crouches behind the altar of Otranto's cathedral, her white habit stained with soot and other things she does not want to examine. Her hands are pressed over the mouth of a girl barely 15, a novice who had been at the convent for only 6 months. To prevent her screaming from revealing their position to the soldiers she can hear moving through the nave. You hear them too, boots against stone metal shifting. Through a gap between the altar and the wall, she can see what is happening. Ottoman soldiers are methodically working through the cathedral, pulling people from their hiding places, separating them into groups. The men are being bound and led outside toward the hill. The people of Otranto call the hill of Minerva. The women are being handled differently. The soldiers are examining them, evaluating, making assessments that Lucia recognizes from her father's livestock markets. Let the calculation of value that precedes sale. She was born Lucia Ferrante, daughter of a merchant who traded in wool and olive oil. She knows what commerce looks like. She knows what happens when human beings become merchandise. Outside, she can hear Archbishop Stefano Agricoli praying. His voice carries through the shattered doors of the cathedral, calm and clear. Despite what must be happening to him, he is reciting the Credo. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And she can hear other voices joining his. Hundreds of male voices raised in a profession of faith that will be their last words. Then the voice stops mid-phrase. She hears something that sounds like sawing. She hears the Archbishop scream, "Frey," but only briefly. And then a sound she will carry with her for the rest of her life. The wet, heavy sound of something being torn apart. The novice beneath her hand convulses, trying to scream. Lucia presses harder, her own tears running silently down her cheeks, her lips moving in prayers she cannot voice. A soldier appears at the altar. He is young, perhaps 20, his face still bearing the softness of adolescence, despite the hardness in his eyes. He looks at Lucia and the novice with an expression she cannot read. These two, he says in accented Italian, still young, undamaged. Other soldiers approach. Hands grab Lucia's arms, drag her from behind the altar, tear her habit as she struggles. The novice is similarly seized. Her screams finally released as the hand that silenced her is pulled away. They are dragged through the cathedral, past the bodies of priests who tried to defend their flock, past the elderly and the children who have been deemed without value and left where they fell. You want to close your ears, but you cannot. She hears everything, the screams, the prayers, the orders, shouted in Turkish, the begging in Italian that accomplishes nothing. She does not yet know that witnessing will become her purpose, that the testimony she will eventually give will help convince a pope that holy war was the only possible response to what the Ottomans did at Otranto. But that comes later. For now, she is dragged toward the harbor, toward the ships that will carry her away from everything she has ever known, toward a fate the soldiers are already discussing in terms she is beginning to understand: prize, property, pleasure. The 800 men who refused to convert to Islam and were beheaded on the Hill of Minerva are famous. They were canonized by Pope Francis in 2013. But the story of what happened to the women, the wives, daughters, and sisters of those 800 men, and the nuns of the convents that dotted the city, that story has never been told publicly. The Ottoman Empire in 1480 was the most powerful military force in the world. Sultan Mehmed I, who had conquered Constantinople 27 years earlier and ended the Byzantine Empire, had spent the intervening decades expanding Ottoman territory in every direction. Greece, Serbia, Albania, the Crimea, all had fallen to Ottoman armies that seemed unstoppable. The Mediterranean itself was becoming an Ottoman lake, with raids on Christian shipping growing more frequent and more devastating each year. Italy watched this expansion with growing terror. The Italian states, but Naples, the Papal States, Venice, Milan, Florence, were locked in their own petty conflicts, unable to unite against a threat that every informed observer understood. You are standing at the edge of this moment, knowing what is coming but unable to stop it. Otranto, a small port city on the heel of the Italian boot, was one of the closest points to Ottoman territory in Albania, only 50 miles across the Adriatic. When the Ottoman fleet appeared on the 28th of July 1480, it carried approximately 18,000 soldiers under the command of Gedik Ahmet Pasha, one of Mehmed's most ruthless commanders. Ahmet Pasha had earned his reputation in campaigns across the Balkans, where his treatment of conquered populations had become legendary for its brutality. Otranto had a garrison of perhaps 400 soldiers and a civilian population of approximately 6,000. The walls were medieval, designed for an earlier era of warfare, inadequate against Ottoman siege techniques that had broken far stronger fortifications. Everyone in the city knew that relief from Naples might take weeks to arrive, if it came at all. The siege lasted 15 days. During those 15 days, the people of Otranto experienced what Ottoman military doctrine called softening, the systematic terrorization of a besieged population through bombardment, starvation, and the display of what would happen to those who resisted. You hear the distant thunder of cannon fire and realize there is nowhere left to retreat. On August 11th, the walls were breached in 3 places simultaneously. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city, and the killing began. Now let us return to Sister Lucia, who was in the convent of Santa Maria del Carmine when the walls fell. The convent stood near the eastern wall of Otranto, close enough that the sisters had heard every cannon shot during the 15-day siege, close enough that they had smelled the smoke from the fires the Ottoman bombardment had ignited in the civilian quarters. The Mother Superior, a woman of 60, named Sister Benedetta, had led them in constant prayer, rosary after rosary, mass after mass, preparation for whatever God intended for them. You feel the vibration in the stone as the door begins to give way. The door shattered. Soldiers poured into the courtyard where the sisters had gathered. 23 women in white habits, their ages ranging from 15 to 68, their faces showing every gradation of terror and resignation. Sister Benedetta stepped forward, her rosary raised, her voice strong. "We are brides of Christ," she said in Latin, then repeated it in Italian when the soldiers showed no understanding. "We are consecrated to God. We are not." The soldier's blade struck before she could finish the sentence. She fell at the feet of the sisters who had followed her for decades, and dark liquids spread across the stones of the courtyard she had walked each morning in prayer. The soldiers moved through the remaining sisters with terrifying efficiency. The elderly were killed immediately. Sister Agnes, Sister Maria Grazia, Sister Thomasa, women who had spent 40 years in contemplation, ended in moments because they had no value in the markets where survivors would be sold. The young were examined, hands pulled at habits, eyes assessed what lay beneath. Calculations were made that Lucia understood with sick clarity she was young, healthy, her face unmarked by age or disease. She was valuable, she was allowed to live. 12 sisters survived the initial massacre. 12 women who would have chosen death with Sister Benedetta were denied that choice because their bodies had value the soldiers intended to realize. They were bound with ropes that bit into wrists accustomed to prayer beads. They were marched from the convent through streets where the violence was still ongoing. You are forced to look as they move her forward. You understand why she does not turn away past the bodies of neighbors and parishioners. Past scenes Lucia forced herself to observe and memorize, because she understood even then that testimony would matter. They were taken to the cathedral where hundreds of other women had fled seeking sanctuary. The sanctuary had failed. The women were being sorted like livestock at market, separated by age and condition, prepared for transport to destinations. The soldiers discussed openly, knowing that captives could not understand Turkish. But one of the sisters could understand. Sister Elena, who had spent years in a Greek community that traded with Ottoman merchants, who had learned enough Turkish to follow basic conversations. There are markets there, buyers who pay well for Italian women, especially those who are, lest she hesitated, untouched, brides of Christ, virgins consecrated to God. Their very status made them more valuable in markets that prized what would be taken before any sale occurred. Lucia felt something shift inside her. The fear did not disappear, but it was joined by something harder, something that would sustain her through what was coming: rage. The cold, steady rage of someone who intends to survive, not despite what is being done to her, but because of it. Who intends to carry the weight of witness through whatever darkness lies ahead. She would remember everything. She would survive, and she would tell the world what the Ottomans did at Otranto. The massacre of the men took place the following morning. The 800 who would become famous as martyrs were gathered on the hill of Minerva outside the city walls, where the entire surviving population, and including the women being held for transport, was forced to witness what happened to those who refused to convert. Lucia watched from the harbor bound with other women on the deck of a ship that was being loaded with plunder. She could see the hill clearly, and she could see the men kneeling in rows as Ottoman executioners moved among them, their blades catching the morning sun. You are close enough to recognize faces, and far enough to know there is nothing you can do. She recognized them. Antonio Ferrante, her cousin, who had once brought her figs from his orchard before she took her vows. Marco the blacksmith, who had repaired the convent's gate hinges and refused payment because work for God's brides was work for God. Father Giovanni, the young priest who had heard her confessions and offered wisdom she had treasured. The killing took hours. 800 men were executed individually, and the hill absorbed the evidence of what was done there until the earth itself appeared darkened. The executioners worked in shifts, resting when their arms grew tired, and returning to continue the destruction of everyone who had chosen death over apostasy. Archbishop Stefano Agricoli was killed differently. Lucia could not see the details from her position on the ship, but she could hear sounds that lasted far longer than a simple execution and the reactions of soldiers who treated suffering as spectacle. Later, she would learn what those sounds meant, and she would carry that knowledge silently for the rest of her life. Women who had been praying fell silent. Women who had been hoping for rescue understood that rescue would not come. Women who had been preparing for martyrdom realized that martyrdom was not being offered to them. Their fate was different, and in some ways worse, because death would have been an ending, and they were being preserved for purposes that had no ending in sight. You feel the moment when hope leaves the deck. The ships departed Otranto that evening carrying approximately 5,000 captives, mostly women and children. The men had been killed on the hill, and the ship sailed east toward Albania, toward markets that had purchased Italian captives for decades, toward futures. The women on deck could not imagine and did not want to. Lucia watched Otranto recede until it became nothing but smoke on the horizon, a smudge marking the place where her life had ended, even though her body continued to function. She memorized the direction of the smoke, the color of the sky, and the faces of the soldiers who had destroyed everything she knew. You understand why she forces herself to remember every detail. She would need these memories later when testimony was required, and when Pope Sixtus IV demanded to know exactly what had happened in the city the Ottomans had destroyed. Now there is something else that must be understood about what happened on those ships. The women of Otranto were not simply transported from their city to the markets of Albania. The journey across the Adriatic, approximately 50 miles and requiring 12 to 18 hours of sailing, was itself part of their ordeal. Ottoman military doctrine distinguished between categories of captives. There were those destined for sale who needed to be kept in conditions suitable for market. There were those distributed among soldiers as rewards for service. And there were those in between women who would be sold eventually, but whose suffering during transport was not considered a loss. The nuns of Santa Maria del Camine fell into this middle category. Their status as consecrated virgins made them valuable, but there were 12 of them, more than any single buyer would want. Some would be sold intact, while others would be claimed as rewards by officers who had distinguished themselves during the siege. Gedik Ahmed Pasha made the selections personally. 4 nuns were taken aside, based on youth and appearance. The remaining 8, including Lucia, were designated for market. Their condition was to be preserved until sale, but preserved did not mean protected. It meant only that certain limits existed, limits that did nothing to shield them from what they heard or from what they understood was happening nearby. Throughout the crossing, sounds carried through the ship for hours, and no one on board ever forgot them. Lucia and the surviving nuns were kept on deck, bound to the rail, exposed to the elements and to the eyes of soldiers who walked past and commented on what they would do if given the opportunity. They were given water but no food. They were not permitted to move, to pray aloud, or to speak to each other. They were being taught what they had become. When dawn broke over the Albanian coast, one of the 4 selected nuns was dead. Sister Elena, the one who would translate Turkish for the others, had somehow managed to throw herself over the rail during the night and drowned before anyone could retrieve her. The soldiers seemed annoyed by this loss of valuable property, but not surprised. It was apparently common for captives to attempt escape through death during transport. You understand that even dying has become a form of resistance. The remaining 3 were dragged onto the deck as the ship approached harbor. They could not walk without assistance. They could not speak coherently. Whatever had happened in those cabins had broken something in them that would never be repaired. Lucia looked at them and understood what had been intended for all of them. She understood that the only difference between herself and those 3 shattered women was the calculation of value that had designated her for market rather than immediate distribution. She added this understanding to the testimony she was building in her mind. She would need to tell the Pope not just what the Ottomans did, but what they intended. Not just the horror that occurred, but the system that produced it. The slave market at Vlhar was where the women of Otranto were sorted for final sale. Vlhar was an Ottoman port city that had served as a transit point for captives from across the Mediterranean for decades. They were stripped of their habits, the white cloth that had marked them as brides of Christ, because the fabric itself could be sold separately. They were given rough shifts that provided minimal coverage. They were examined by men who checked their teeth, their skin, and their bodies. They confirmed the virginity that increased their value and noted the youth and health that would attract premium buyers. You feel how methodical this process is and how little room it leaves for mercy. They were kept together. The 7 surviving nuns in a holding cell with other Italian women from Otranto, perhaps 60 women in total, crowded into a space designed for half that number. They waited for auctions that would distribute them throughout Ottoman territory. During those days of waiting, Lucia gathered testimony. She spoke to every woman who would talk. She learned names, families, what they had witnessed who had died, and how they had been captured. She memorized everything because she had nothing to write with and nowhere to keep written records. She built a catalogue of atrocity in her mind, organized by victim, by perpetrator, by location, and by date. A woman named Giovanna told her about the cathedral where Ottoman soldiers had cornered women seeking sanctuary and worked through them systematically for 3 days before the survivors were loaded onto ships. Giovanna's daughter, 12 years old, had been taken from her arms and given to a soldier who had distinguished himself during the siege. A woman named Caterina told her about the archbishop's death, which she had witnessed from much closer than Lucia. The act had not been random brutality, but calculated cruelty intended to prolong suffering. Caterina had been held in place and forced to watch as a lesson in what resistance produced. A woman named Beatrice told her about the convent of San Francesco, where elderly monks had been killed in their chapel while soldiers looted the treasury. The smoke had been visible from where the women were being held, and the screams had continued longer than Beatrice could explain. Lucia recorded everything, name after name, atrocity after atrocity. She built the testimony that would eventually reach Rome and convince Pope Sixtus even that the Ottoman threat required a military response that went beyond diplomacy and negotiation. The auction was held on the 5th day after their arrival. Lucia was sold to a merchant named Hamza Alpter, a trader who specialized in Italian captives and who recognized the particular value of educated women who could read and write. The price was 28 ducats higher than average for a woman of her age, reflecting her literacy and the cachet of her status as a former nun. Hamza was not cruel by the standards of the trade he practiced. She worked in his household for 11 months. During those months, she continued gathering testimony. You can feel how survival becomes a discipline rather than a hope. Hamza's trading operation brought him into contact with captives from throughout the Mediterranean, not just Otranto, but Venetian territories, Greek islands, and Italian coastal cities attacked by Ottoman raiders. Lucia listened to everyone who passed through, memorized their stories, and added their experiences to the catalogue she was building. Pope Sixtus IV, priests who maintained contact with Orthodox Christians in Ottoman territory. He learned about the 800 martyrs whose deaths were commemorated by captives who had witnessed the executions. He learned about the women whose fates were softened in official records, but described plainly in private correspondence. And he learned that the Ottomans were not finished. Gedik Ahmed Pasha's expedition to Otranto had been a test, a probe of Italian defenses that revealed fatal weaknesses. More attacks were planned. The entire Italian peninsula was at risk. The Pope began planning his response. Lucia's opportunity for escape came 13 months after her capture in September 1481. Sultan Mehmed I had died in May of that year, and the succession struggle between his sons threw the Ottoman military into disarray. The liberation of Otranto was celebrated throughout Italy as proof that Ottoman expansion could be reversed. But for the captives already transported to Albania and beyond, liberation meant nothing. They were still property, still held in Ottoman territory, and still waiting for buyers whose purposes they feared, except that chaos creates openings. Hamza Alpter's business suffered during the instability. Shipping was disrupted, markets were uncertain, and he found himself holding more captives than he could maintain. He began selling at reduced prices, accepting whatever buyers offered in order to survive. Lucia was purchased by a Greek merchant named Nikolaos Papadopoulos, whose wife needed domestic help, and who sought Italian women because of their reputation for cleanliness and education. Nikolaos was Orthodox Christian. His household included a chapel where services were held weekly. His trade connections reached Venice, whose ships passed regularly through the ports where he did business. You recognize the moment when preparation finally meets opportunity. Maria helped. The journey from Albania to Venice took 3 months and involved multiple ships, forged documents, bribes to customs officials, and the cooperation of a network of Orthodox and Catholic Christians who had learned how to move people and information through Ottoman-controlled territory. Lucia traveled hidden in cargo holds, disguised as a merchant's wife, and concealed among goods that served as their own form of camouflage. She moved from port to port, each transfer bringing her closer to safety, and each night in hiding testing her resolve to survive and testify. She arrived in Venice in December 1481, nearly 18 months after her capture at Otranto. She was thin and exhausted, wearing clothes that bore no resemblance to the habit she had once treasured. But she was free, and she carried testimony that would change how Pope Sixtus even understood the Ottoman threat. The Venetian authorities were initially skeptical. Many refugees arrived claiming important information and seeking support. You can sense how repetition becomes a form of resistance. She traveled to Rome, where she met with papal officials and repeated her account to scribes who recorded every detail of the 7 nuns who had survived the initial sorting at Florhair. She had lost track of all but one. Sister Magdalena had been purchased by a household in Thessaloniki and was eventually ransomed by relatives who paid an enormous sum to recover her. Magdalena's testimony confirmed and extended Lucia's account. Together, the 2 surviving nuns provided a picture of the Ottoman captive system that no male observer could have compiled. because no male observer had experienced what the women endured. The three nuns distributed to officers on the ship, Sister Clara, Sister Agatha, and Sister Francesca, were never found. They disappeared into a system designed to make people disappear. And the testimony that Lucia and others had provided entered the historical record, ensuring that what happened at Otranto would not be forgotten even as the immediate crisis faded. Lucia lived for another 43 years, dying in 1524 at the age of 70. She never returned to religious life, never took new vows, never rejoined the order that had been destroyed at Otranto. The night grows quieter now. The long road behind us settles somewhere. Far back in time, stone still holds the cold at dawn. You can almost hear it. Not screams, not prayers, just the hush that follows. If this journey stayed with you, if these whispers mattered, you are welcome to leave a gentle sign, a like, a share, a quiet subscription. Thank you for walking this path with me. Goodbye, and we will meet again.